Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Donna McGregor and I'm one of the lecturers in anatomy here at QUT. Today I'm here to talk to you about the blood and how it's pumped around the body. So we're going to be talking about the heart and the blood vessels. The heart is a pump, is the pump of the cardiovascular system. It is essential for giving the cells of the body what they need to survive, and that is oxygen. So it is the delivery system for a number of components, but most importantly for oxygen. It is important to realise that the heart is an organ and it's made up of different tissue types such as muscle and connective tissue. The first topic I'd like to talk about today though is blood. If we're going to talk about how it's delivered, it's probably important that we understand why we need blood or what our blood does for us. Even though you may not think so, blood is a connective tissue. That is, it has all the connective tissue features. That's cells and a matrix, which is fluid, in this case called plasma. The blood has four functions. These four functions, primary functions, are transportation. So it helps to transport gases, oxygen, to our cells within the body, and then also it helps to transport nutrients to the cells. But it also removes metabolic waste that come from our cells and returns that to a waste system. It's important for immunity from disease, and this involves the white blood cells or the leukocytes. It's important for buffering, and that is to maintain constant pH. And that is achieved by the proteins in there which prevent undesirable osmotic effects. And then there's temperature regulation. So this is when, for example, on a hot day, when you've been exercising or that, you'll notice a lot of possibly the veins, the superficial veins, and that on the back of your hand will actually swell and become quite superficial, and it's trying to release the heat from the body. So it helps to regulate temperature also within our body. So what is blood made up of? Well, it's approximately half fluid and the other half cells. When I say approximately, it's a 55-45% split. So the first component is plasma. That's the liquid component, the liquid matrix. And that constitutes about 55% of the total blood volume. Of this 55%, 91.5% is water. There's another 7% that's made up of various proteins. And these proteins include albumin, which helps to buffer the pH and maintain those osmotic conditions. Globulin, which is the antibodies that prevent immunity from infections. And then fibrinogen, which is involved to help your blood to clot if it gets cut. There's also other components as well to a smaller extent, and these are about 1.5% of the solutes, and they're the wastes and the nutrients and hormones. The cellular components of blood. The cellular components constitute approximately 45% of the total blood volume, and there's three main formed elements. And these formed elements in the blood are the erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets. The erythrocytes are by far the most numerous within the blood. Approximately 99% of our cellular components are erythrocytes, and these erythrocytes are our red blood cells. That's what they're also called, and they're very important in the transport of gases, particularly oxygen, to the cells of the body. There's approximately 5 billion of these per mil. We also have leukocytes, which are our white blood cells, and they are important for immunity from disease. And then we have platelets. And the platelets are important because they help to form clots to limit the blood loss. So we're going to talk about each of these elements, and first of all we're going to talk about the erythrocytes. The most abundant formed element in blood is the erythrocytes, as we saw before. Their key role is gas transport. Cells require oxygen because they need to make a molecule called ATP, which the cells use to power a number of processes within the cell. So for example, cells need it for muscle contraction and things like that. So what they have is the red blood cells, or the erythrocytes, delivering oxygen to help with that ATP or that pump. And it also helps them to remove waste from the body after the cellular metabolism has occurred. If it's allowed to build up it makes the cellular environment acidic, which is toxic for the cells. So if this C2 builds up, it becomes a quite toxic environment. So it's important that, as well as delivering oxygen, it removes carbon dioxide. The erythrocytes live for approximately 120 days. They're very small. They're approximately 7 microns, and they have this, we call it a donut or biconcave shaped disc. So if we look at this upper image, from one side to the other is 7 microns, but in the cross section you can see it's got this biconcave shape about it. And this is important, having this biconcave shape, because it actually increases the surface area to allow for more oxygen attachment. The red blood cells also lack nuclei and organelles, so they won't stain up, and we'll talk about that shortly. So they lack nuclei and organelles within their cytoplasm. Red blood cells do contain the hemoglobin protein, which is where the oxygen molecule attaches to for transport through the blood system. In this slide, this is actually showing the hemoglobin molecule. Up at the top of the screen, what we can see is a red blood cell, and part of that surface, the image has been expanded into this illustration to show the makeup of the hemoglobin molecule. A hemoglobin molecule consists of 4 globular protein chains, and these consist of 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. Each globular unit, so either that be a beta unit chain or an alpha chain, each globular unit has a heme group, which we can see on this alpha chain where it's been extended out to see the chemical composition. And this heme group is where the O2 actually binds, and it binds at the iron atom here, as you can see at this point, the red point here, or the iron atom as indicated there. So this slide shows how oxygen is moved from the lungs, in this image, through to the body cells removed from that. Oxygen in the alveoli within the lungs diffuses into the bloodstream. At this point, it will bind with the hemoglobin in the red blood cells, which is what we're seeing at this point here. This is the activity going on. The oxygen is being bound or is attaching to the hemoglobin. The red blood cell then flows to a region of the body where oxygen concentration is low. So this could be any body region or muscle tissue. At this point, the hemoglobin will give up the oxygen diffuses into the body cells, and then the red blood cells returns to the lungs for reoxygenation of its surface. So that concludes our discussion on the red blood cells. So the next one that we saw previously was the leukocytes, the white blood cells, and they help to protect the body from disease. The white blood cells arise from the bone marrow, as does the red bone marrow, as does red blood cells. So they arise from the same location. However, you will notice that in terms of total composition of the cellular components within the blood, the white blood cells only contribute 0.1 to 0.2% of the blood cells. Further characteristics of white blood cells is they contain hemoglobin. They lack hemoglobin. The red blood cells have hemoglobin, the white blood cells lack hemoglobin. But what it does contain is a nuclei. So white blood cells will have a nuclei. These leukocytes are important to provide the body with defense against microorganisms. They help to kill fungi, bacteria, parasites, and virus-infected cells. In this image here, we can see the red blood cells, this biconcave disc of the red blood cells, and amongst those are these white blood cells or the leukocytes. Here are the main classes of leukocytes found in the blood. Now, as you can see, there's 5 main types of leukocytes, and these are classified based on 3 criteria: the presence of granules in the cytoplasm, the staining patterns, and the shape of the nucleus. So in this point here, when we talk about the presence of granules in the cytoplasm, They are present in the granulocytes. So leukocytes is divided into granulocytes and agranulocytes. And granulocytes contain granules in the cytoplasm. The shape of the nucleus differs between the different types of leukocytes that we have, and the staining patterns also vary. Some of these leukocytes are very easy to find in the blood specimens, while others are relatively rare. So in terms of when we talk about what is the most abundant type of leukocyte in the blood, well, there's a little rhyme. Never let monkeys eat bananas. Sounds a bit interesting, but what it means is neutrophils. Neutrophils have got the highest abundance in terms of classification of the highest type of leukocyte in the body, or in blood rather. So neutrophils, never let, then lymphocytes, monkeys, monocytes, eosinophils, the eat, and then bananas, the basophil. So it's an order from here. The most abundant, next most abundant, then this one, second least abundant, least abundant. The last formed element in the blood that I'll discuss are the platelets. The platelets are also called thrombocytes, and they're probably more like cell fragments that contain bags of protein that help your blood to clot. So they're actually fragments of larger cells called the megakaryocytes that are found in the bone marrow. So they're pieces that are broken away and contain protein, and they are the part that's informed with the blood clotting. The primary role is to assist with blood clotting, but some of the other key features about platelets are that it lacks a nucleus. It's small, it's 2 to 4, sorry, that should not be millimeters, that should be microns in diameter. They possess cell organelles, so they will have granules in their cytoplasm, and they're derived from these larger cells within the bone marrow. And there's approximately 300,000 platelets per ml of blood. Platelets are very unique because what they do is they stick to the sides of the damaged blood vessels. They initiate the formation of a web of protein called fibrin, and then the platelet then will secrete factors that promote the repair of the damaged blood wall. So they don't just clot, they actually help in the repair process as well. So they are a very unique type of cell. This image here shows the overall typical collection of platelets in the blood. You note that the yellow arrows are pointing to 3 very relatively densely stained structures, and these are the platelets. They are oval to circular in shape, and they're only about a quarter of the size of the red blood cells that sit adjacent to them. So these are the red blood cells, they're bond concave discs, and about a quarter of the size we find the platelets. And because of the numerous organelles that they have, the organelles containing protein, they stain quite densely, quite dense pink using this stain. So now that concludes our discussion about the blood and the components of blood. Now we're going to talk about the cardiovascular system. The heart acts as a pump for 2 circuits within the body. Blood that is low in oxygen is pumped to the right side of the heart. Sorry, getting the arrow back up here. Low or deoxygenated blood is returned to the right side of the heart, whereas pumped into the pulmonary circuit. And this is our pulmonary circuit through here, as we can see, going to the lungs, where the blood will pick up, in the lungs, will pick up oxygen. And it becomes oxygenated and it returns then to the left side of the heart. From the left side of the heart, it returns, the blood is pumped out into and away from the heart to the organs and the body cells away from the heart. So when we look at these 2 circuits, that first circuit where the deoxygenated blood is pumped out to the lungs and oxygenated blood is returned to the left side of the heart, that is the pulmonary circulation. The systemic circulation, indicated by number 2 there, delivers the oxygenated blood from the heart out to the organs and the cells of the body. And then thirdly, there's this third circulation that delivers oxygenated blood to the heart tissue itself. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. But central to all of this is the heart. The right and left side of the heart acts as pumps, be it in the pulmonary system or be it in the systemic system. This slide summarises some of the key features of the heart. In simple terms, it is a double-chambered pump sitting side by side. And this is a very simplistic view of that, but that's what these two pumps represent at this point here. It's a double pump with 4 chambers. It has to generate enough pressure to pump the blood vessels to the lungs, and that is through into the pulmonary circuit and then to the rest of the body, and that's the systemic circuit. The heart is responsible for pumping approximately 7,000 litres of blood per day through 100,000 kilometres of vessels. Now these are approximate figures, but they are quite large numbers and very true when you take into account our capillary systems and our arterioles and all our fine, tiny little blood vessels located within our organs. The heart is the pump by which to facilitate transport, and its transport mechanism for gases and nutrients and the hormones, immune components and metabolic waste. It is the mechanism by which all these happen and pumps that circuit. So let's take a look at the heart. At this slide here, it shows the location of the heart in your body. It's located in the thoracic cavity, deep to the ribs. And the ribs, being bony structures, and the costal cartilages associated with those that attach into the sternum, help to protect the heart. The specific section of the heart, specific section of the thoracic cavity that the heart sits in is called the mediastinum, or some people might say the mediastinum. And it's the central region. In the thoracic cavity, we have the 2 pleural cavities. We have a left and right pleural cavity, and in the midsection, we have the mediastinum. This image at the top of the screen shows a superficial view, so it gives you an approximate of where the ribs and our sternum, the body of the sternum, sits. And notice there's a cross and a circle, both in red. A deeper illustration is once we remove the ribs, we see down to those same approximate locations of the red cross and the red circle, and we can see how they match or relate to the bony structures above them. Just as an approximate, but please remember that the heart sits within the mediastinum. Also notice in this slide that the heart sits more to the left. This is our midline structure, but the heart is more to the left. And it normally sits with a slight tilt on it, so that it goes down from the right to the left. So from right to left, there's a slight tilt from what would be the base of the heart down here to the apex of the heart at this point here. This slide talks about, or is an illustration and an introduction to the gross anatomy of the heart. And this serves to show you the names of the vessels or the particular chambers of the heart. So as we said before, the heart is essentially 2 pumps operating in parallel and pumping at the same rate. It consists of 4 chambers. So the 2 pumps would be the right side of the heart and the other being the left side of the heart. Each side of the heart is broken down into 2 chambers. So in total we have 4 chambers. The 2 superior chambers, this one here and this one here, are the atria. So singular is atrium and plural is atria, and they receive the great vessels of the heart or from the body. The inferior 2 chambers, or the lower 2 chambers, are the left and the right ventricles, and these are responsible for pumping the blood. The right ventricle pumps the blood, the oxygenated blood, to the lungs, and the left ventricle is the pump of the systemic system, of the systemic circuit, where the right ventricle, as we said before, is the pump of the pulmonary circuit. The right ventricle, and though it's a little bit hard to see in this image, the walls of the left ventricle tend to be thicker than the walls of the right ventricle. And that's because the left ventricle has to pump the heart further away. This slide shows the heart, still a diagram, but more representative of what the heart looks like, a nice illustration. But it's showing the heart that has been cut down the middle. You can see the small superior atria being the right atrium and the left atrium, and these receive the blood from the great vessels. Note with the atria that they have fairly thin walls because they only need to pump blood a very small distance to the ventricles. So blood from the atrium will pass down through valves into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it's pumped up into the pulmonary trunk and up to the pulmonary circuit. Oxygenated blood from the heart, the lungs, return to the left atrium and are collected there, where the blood then passes down through valves into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, blood is then pumped up through another valve into the aorta and returns to the system and moves out into the systemic circulation. So when we look at the atria, we do notice that they do have very thin walls because the blood only needs to pass from the atria down into the ventricles. However, you can see that the two large ventricles inferiorly and the dividing septum that we call the interventricular septum because it's the septum between the ventricles. The right ventricle pumps blood to the lungs, as we said, and the left ventricle pumps the blood to the rest of the body. And this is why when you look at the left ventricle and the walls of the left ventricle are very thick when you compare them to the walls of the right ventricle. The right ventricle only has to pump to the lungs, where the left ventricle has to pump to the entirety of the body. The chambers of the heart are attached to the great vessels, and we'll talk about the great vessels shortly, and they allow blood to flow into and out of the heart. Some basic facts about the heart. It is a small, relatively small conical organ, and it only weighs about 250 to 350 grams in the average person. The heart sits medial to the lungs within the mediastinum. It is lined by a protective membrane, a special fibrous membrane called the pericardium. And the heart is positioned so it's the right atrium and right ventricle are located more anteriorly than the chambers of the left side. So it's somewhat rotated that when we look at anteriorly at the heart, we're seeing mostly the right atrium and the right ventricle. The base of the heart is the posterior-superior surface of the heart, formed primarily by the left atrium. And that's almost it's the posterior surface, but the superior aspect of the posterior surface. The apex, on the other hand, is the inferior conical aspect, and it projects antero-inferiorly towards the left side of the body, and it forms the apex. And this apex is related to the left ventricle. So now we're going to talk about the layers in the heart wall and the membrane that wraps around it. Like most organs in the body cavities, the heart is wrapped in a protective lining. The lining is very important for anchoring the heart in position while still allowing lots of movement. So it allows the heart to move, to expand and contract during the respiratory cycle and the heart cycle. However, we don't want it moving out of its position within the mediastinum. This lining of the heart is called the pericardium, and has two major parts. It's a double-sided fibrous sac lining the heart, and it prevents the heart from overflowing with the blood and contains a cavity. The cavity is important because it has a lubricating fluid that reduces friction. So as it moves across the surface of the heart, it allows it to move freely without any friction. The fibrous pericardium attaches firmly to the sternum and to the central tendon of the thoracic diaphragm. and it helps to suspend the heart in the thoracic cavity and prevent it from being overstretched. The internal aspect of the heart has the myocardium, and that is the muscular wall of the heart that's responsible for pumping the blood. And it contains a special type of muscle tissue called cardiac tissue. You recall that there's the various types of muscle tissue, but cardiac muscle tissue is a very specialised form of cardiac tissue, of muscle tissue. Now, if we cut the heart open, cut the heart wall and open it up to, the most obvious thing we see is the 4 distinct chambers, as we've spoken about before. That being the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. So these are, as we saw before, there's vessels that are responsible for pumping the blood, particularly the ventricles. But the two smaller superior chambers of the heart are the atria, and they receive blood from veins. They are relatively thin-walled, and their function is to pump the blood simply into the ventricles below them. Within the atria, there are a number of key features, and one being the fossa ovalis, and it's a hole on the wall between the two atria, and it's a remnant of the hole that was in the fetal heart that allowed the blood to bypass the lungs and function on the mother's circulation during pregnancy. The key role of the atria is to act like a reception point for collecting blood coming in from the body, so that deoxygenated blood is collected here before it's then pumped or moves into the ventricles. So that yellow indicates our atria. The two larger inferior chambers of the heart receive the blood from the atria. They have relatively thick walls, as we've spoken about before, and their role is to pump blood into arteries, be that the pulmonary artery into the pulmonary circulation, or be that into the aorta for the systemic circulation from here. They are separated by that muscular interventricular septum. So we keep talking about the heart as a pump. And like any pump, it has to have a valve within the system. Pumps need valves to help regulate the flow of any fluid through that, much like the tap in our illustration. And what we can see here, by having that illustration, these valves in a certain position, they're on and they're off, that allows the flow of water. But in our case, when we talk about the heart, we're talking about the blood. So these valves help to regulate the flow of blood in the correct direction and regulate the volume of that flow. There are two valves in the heart that are called atrioventricular valves, or AV valves. As the name suggests, these valves lie between the atrium and the ventricles. So the name gives a clear description as to their location within the heart. They are important to prevent blood from flowing back into the atria when the ventricles are contracting. So when the ventricles are contracting is when they're actually pumping. And we want that blood to be pumped in the right direction, not back to where it come from. So to ensure that it goes off into the arteries, the valve closes so no blood can backflow back into those atria. The AV valve on the right side, between the right atrium and the right ventricle, is called the tricuspid valve. And it's because the valve consists of 3 flaps or cusps. So that we call them cusps or flaps. And because there are 3 of them, we call it the tricuspid valve. On the left-hand side or the left pump and the left ventricle, the left side of the heart, we have another AV valve, and it only has 2 flaps in this case, and therefore is given the name bicuspid valve. Though you may also see terminology as mitral valve. The mitral valve is like a bishop's mitre, and that's how it gets its name from there too. But bicuspid and tricuspid are probably the easier terminologies to remember. Now, attached to these cusps and these flaps, are chordae tendineae. These are cartilaginous cords that anchor the AV valves, and particularly the cusp of the valves, to the papillary muscles within the walls of the ventricle. When the papillary muscles contract, they pull the chordae tendineae, which opens the valves, the AV valve, allowing blood to pass through. And in a moment, we'll see a description, or we'll see what these structures look like. This slide now shows the names of those valves. We've seen this image before, but the difference with this image now is that the valves are being named. As we can see here, we have the tricuspid valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and the cusp is attached to those cartilaginous structures called the chordae tendineae. These chordae tendineae, we can see, attached down to these little finger-like projections that extend from the walls of the ventricles, which are called the papillary muscles. On the left side of the heart, between the left atrium and the left ventricle, we have the bicuspid valve, or mitral valve. As we said before, the key role of these valves is to stop blood flowing back into the atrium while the ventricles are contracted. This slide shows the operation of the AV valves. When the ventricle is relaxed, the AV valve is open. So blood flows freely from the atrium to the ventricle, as we can see here. Now, when the ventricle contracts, the AV valve closes. So the blood's contained within the ventricles, the AV valve shuts to stop any backflow, and during contraction of this ventricle, it causes the blood to be pushed into either the pulmonary circuit or to the systemic circuit, but it does not return back into the atrium because the valves are closed, and that's what its role is there to serve. So we talked about the the atrioventricular valves. We have 2 more valves in the heart, so in total there are 4 valves in the heart. The other 2 valves are called semilunar valves. Now, semilunar valves are important because they are at the junction of the ventricles into those arteries, into the systemic circulation or the pulmonary circulation. They lie between the ventricles and those major arteries that are exiting the heart, and they will be the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Their role is to prevent blood flowing from the arteries back into the heart, and each consists of 3 crescent-shaped cusps, which is how it partially gets its name, the lunar shape or the crescent shape of the cusp. These 2 valves have specific names, being the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve. The names are quite descriptive and describe where they are, but just to clarify, the pulmonary semilunar valve lies between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. The aortic semilunar valve lies between the left ventricle and the aorta. This slide shows the position of the semilunar valves. This is the same image as we had before. It's the anterior view that's sectioned through the heart. Also included on the slide is still our tricuspid valve and our bicuspid or mitral valve, but instead on this one it's labelled with the pulmonary trunk and the valves. So this is more to indicate the valves, but you can still see the other 2 atrioventricular valves we spoke about before, as with the atria also. The pulmonary semilunar valve is located between the right atrium and the pulmonary trunk. So this is the large artery that leaves the right ventricle to go to the heart, to the lungs, to be oxygenated. So that takes all that deoxygenated blood. And that is the valve at that point there. It's the pulmonary semilunar valve. The aortic semilunar valve is located at the base of the aorta. So as the ventricle, or as the aorta arises from the ventricle, there is another semilunar valve, which is hard to see in this anterior view because we need the pulmonary trunk removed. So therefore we have the superior view, which is on the right of the screen, and it shows those approximate relationships. This This is a superior view, but if we look at it this way, this is an anterior, this is posterior. On this side, we've got the left side of the heart and then the right side. And I say this because it's trying to give you some orientation, because this is our pulmonary semilunar valve. There's our aortic semilunar valve in here. And then what we see here are two more valves. And these are at the atrioventricular valves. 3 cusps, meaning tricuspid valve, and 2 cusps there being the bicuspid valve on the left side of the heart. So the semilunar valves, how do they function? Well, they're important that when the ventricle contracts, the semilunar valves are open, as we can see from this image here. So the ventricle contracts, semilunar valve opens to allow the blood to flow from the ventricle to the artery. When the ventricle is relaxed and therefore filling from the atria, the semilunar valve is closed, and therefore it will stop the flow of any of the blood within the artery that's been just pumped into the artery from flowing back into the ventricle, as we can see here. And it's contained then in these great vessels. The great vessels of the heart. The great vessels of the heart is a term for all the major structures entering into the atrium, or the vessels leaving the ventricles. So those large structures or large vessels entering into the atria include on the right side the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. So we can see those listed here. On the left side, the left atrium receives 4 pulmonary veins. So those 4 pulmonary veins returning oxygenated blood from the lungs into the left side of the heart. The superior and inferior vena cava transport deoxygenated blood from the body and returns it to the heart to start the oxygenation process again. On the right side, the ventricle, the great vessel or the large artery associated with the right ventricle is the pulmonary trunk. And then on the left side of the left ventricle, it is the aorta. It is the large vessel that's associated with this chamber of the heart. So let's have a look at these structures in these illustrations. The image on the right of the screen is an anterior view. The image on the left of your screen is a posterior view. So let's start with the anterior view, because this is what we've been using through the lecture thus far. Let's work through some of these structures. We have the superior vena cava, and then we have the inferior vena cava. Notice they're blue because that's denoting that it's deoxygenated blood, but they're almost a vertical structure, vertical in alignment, and they drain, both of these structures drain into the right atrium. Now it's a bit hard to see the right atrium here when it's not cut open like some of our other illustrations, but how we know this is the right atrium is that we see the auricle. This structure here is called the auricle of the heart. It's a little dog ear that sits, that's an extension of the right atrium. We have these auricles on the left atrium also, but in this case here, this depicts the area of our right atrium. Blood is pumped from there down into our right ventricle. Remember before we said that in its normal position, most of the anterior aspect of the heart is the right atrium and right ventricle. Though just notice that out here at the apex, so from these blood vessels across this to the apex, this is part of the left ventricle. But most of the anterior surface or aspect view that we have of the heart is the right atrium and right ventricle. So from the right atrium, blood's pumped into the right ventricle, and the right ventricle then the blood moves up through the pulmonary semilunar valve up to the pulmonary trunk, and then it divides to go become the left and right pulmonary arteries. So from here, let's now move over to the posterior view. So we can see on this view here, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava going up into the right atrium. At this point here, we're looking at this part here that's now just split into the left and right pulmonary arteries. And they are delivering deoxygenated blood to the lung so it can be oxygenated and then returned. It is then returned through these vessels here, the pulmonary veins. We have 2 from the right and 2 from the left. They return oxygenated blood, and that is collected in the left atrium. That's our left atrium here. We cannot see the left atrium on an anterior view. We do need a posterior view, and this left atrium in this area here is considered the base of the heart. So this is the base of the heart, and this is the apex of the heart. So those are the pulmonary veins draining or emptying the oxygenated blood into the left atrium. From the left atrium, the blood goes through the bicuspid valve. It's moved into the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle, it will be pumped up into the aorta through the aortic semilunar valve. So looking at this way here, there's our aorta again. And from a posterior view, here's our aorta. Notice that when the aorta leaves the heart, it arches, it extends vertically, and then it arches, but it arches posteriorly and to the left. And this is it's just an interesting position because it's going down to run along the vertebral column in the body. So we've just talked about that using the diagram, but just to break it down in some more detail for your reflection later. The vessels of the right atrium include the superior and the inferior vena cava, delivering deoxygenated blood from the body. In the right ventricle, the main or the great vessel associated with that, or the artery, is the pulmonary trunk, and this delivers deoxygenated blood to the lungs. The left atrium, as we stated before, that is the left and the right pulmonary veins, which are returning oxygenated blood to the heart, and that is emptying into the left atrium. Even though it looks like it is here, going to the right atrium, it is not. These vessels empty into the left atrium at the base of the heart. And then our left ventricle delivers oxygenated blood to the entirety of the body through the aorta. So that talks about the that talks about our systemic circulation and our pulmonary circulation. Now there was a third type of circulation that we noted before, and that's called the coronary circulation. The heart is an important structure. It pumps the blood and maintains all those structures and functions we spoke about earlier. So therefore, it needs to supply its own muscle wall. And to do that, the heart requires about 1/20th of the body's blood supply. The coronary circulation provides the functional blood to supply the walls of the heart, the myocardium. So to help the heart to be able to function, to be able to pump, it needs its own blood supply of oxygenated blood. So the arterial blood supply for the coronary circulation is provided by 2 arteries called the right and left coronary arteries. And these arise from the base of the aorta. When we say the base of the aorta, as immediately after the aorta leaves the left ventricle and immediately after that aortic semilunar valve, there are 2 small arteries that rise off the lateral sides of the aorta, and these are the left and right coronary arteries, and their sole purpose is to supply oxygenated blood to the walls of the heart. Most coronary blood, that's about 70% of that, flows when the ventricles are relaxed. So most of the coronary blood moving through these vessels, the coronary vessels, flows during the relaxed heart, which is considered diastole. And when we say when the heart's relaxed, we're actually talking about the ventricles being relaxed, because they are the pumps. So the major arteries of the coronary circulation are the right coronary artery. So before we look at this, just to reorientate ourselves, this is an anterior view. There's the pulmonary trunk's being cut. There's the aorta, and the pulmonary trunk's just been cut at this point here, so we can see some of the vessels. We've got the superior and inferior vena cava. There's the auricle of the right atrium. That's the right ventricle, and over here we'll have the left ventricle. The right coronary artery is the lateral branch to the right of the aorta. And here it is here, we can see it through there. This red structure as it passes through there. This is the right coronary artery. On the left side, we have the left coronary artery. Interesting to note that the left coronary artery is only a couple of centimetres long, because what it does, it finishes by dividing into 2 other new branches, which is the circumflex artery and the anterior interventricular artery. The right coronary artery, on the other hand, continues through the groove between the atrium and the ventricles, the atrioventricular groove, all the way around to the posterior surface of the heart. And as it does that, it gives off branches like the marginal artery here on the right side, or the right aspect of the heart. Note with the left coronary artery, as I said, it branches into the circumflex artery and it branches into the interventricular artery. That interventricular artery it's no coincidence that it actually runs over the interventricular septum that we learnt about before. It's the wall that separates the right and the left ventricles of the heart, and that's where this runs through. So that is a surface marking that divides the right ventricle from the right atrium. Right ventricle from the left ventricle. That's to be more clear. Now, it's essential that the coronary circulation system keeps working efficiently. If any blockages of the coronary arteries can potentially starve the heart tissue and of oxygen and nutrients. This can cause the heart tissue to die. So this essentially is the mechanism of a heart attack. If a coronary vessel is beginning to become blocked by fatty deposits building up, usually surgical intervention can help to correct the problem if caught early enough. With the fatty build-up, though, can lead to a clot forming, and if that blocks the coronary artery, it will lead to death of the heart tissue. It will lead to a heart attack. So it's very important that if someone is or that a person who may have coronary heart disease is diagnosed early, so surgical intervention can correct the situation. Otherwise, ultimately, the person could land up with infarction or a heart attack. That's essentially what this slide's showing the artery blocking up. This is a representation of the small coronary artery, and when that happens, the tissue or the heart wall is not being received by those essential oxygen and nutrients anymore. And then what happens is that tissue will die. Now, we're going to talk about the peripheral circulation. So the peripheral circulation is all that circulation away from the heart. So we had the coronary circulation, this is the peripheral circulation. This is how the blood is pumped around the body in a closed loop of specialized vessels. And these types of vessels include arteries, capillaries, and veins. So there's 3 types of vessels that we will talk about. But do remember, this is a closed loop. So all blood that leaves the heart is passed through the arteries, exchanged, moves through the capillaries, and then returns to the heart via these veins. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Capillaries allow oxygen exchange between the blood and the tissue. So this is where usually the gaseous exchange will occur. And then the veins return the deoxygenated blood to the heart. Now, it's important to note that arteries and veins share a similar basic structure in that they have 3 walls, and three walls or 3 layers, or in this case, tunics. So tunics meaning layers. So they tend to be described more as tunics. 3 layers as such, or tunics. Now, arteries and veins will all have these 3 layers, but the thickness will vary between of each layer will vary whether it's an artery or a vein, and we'll talk about that in more detail. 3 basic layers are the most internal layer. This is the tunica intima, and it's the innermost layer that's lined with smooth epithelium. So that's the tunica intima. So it's a very thin layer through here. Then we have the tunica media, which is the middle layer. It's smooth muscle, and it's got quite a bit of elastic tissue also. And that's what we're seeing here. This is a schematic, and this is a transverse section through a vessel. Then the most external layer is the tunica adventitia, and it's the outer lining connective tissue that contains collagen and elastic fibers, as you can see. It is important to note, however, that there are some major differences in the thickness of those layers and the composition of these layers at the various sites through the cardiovascular system. So we're going to talk about the different layers now associated with the blood vessels. The tunica intima, or it's also called the interna. So tunica intima or tunica interna. And these names are provided to you because various textbooks may use a version of these. They may use the word intima, some may use the word interna. So it's just for you to be familiar with the variety of terms that could be used for the same feature. The tunica intima surrounds the lumen of the vessel. It's the inner lining of simple squamous epithelium. So really it's a series of endothelial cells. And this will be important later on when we talk about capillaries. The tunica media is the middle layer, and it has a lot of smooth muscle in a varying degree and those elastic fibers. Note that the tunica media is really thick in arteries. It is extremely thick in arteries and very thin in veins. Now this is important because if you are looking at a cadaveric specimen or a model, or that, even in death when the blood has been removed from the body, the artery will maintain its rigor and its shape, so its circular shape at all times, where veins tend to collapse. So the thickness of this layer is very important to maintaining the integrity of the vessel. The tunica adventitia is also called the tunica external, and it's the outermost layer composed of elastic and collagenous fibers, and it's relatively thick in veins, this one. So this is particularly looking at an artery now. So this is looking at those three layers, but their relative compositions to each other in a cross-section of an artery. Now arteries are important, as we found, because there is oxygenated blood running through those vessels. But more importantly, there's also high pressure. There's high blood pressure. And because of this high blood pressure, it needs to be protected and supported. And by and to achieve that, what we have is a thick layer, muscular layer of being the tunica media. And that helps to support and absorb and helps to the blood vessel or the artery to contract. So with each beat of the heart, it can contract and relax very quickly. And this is important for that layer. You can notice also that the tunica intima is a very thin layer internally. Then we have the media with its elastic layer and muscular layer, and the tunica adventitia as well. We will talk more about the structure of veins later on when we talk about veins, but now we're going to talk about some of the major branches of the aorta. As we saw before, the main artery of leaving the heart to the systemic circulation is the aorta. The aorta ascends, then it arches before it then curves and descends down through the body and giving off a number of branches. The aortic arch, so that part that we spoke about a little bit earlier, the curvature of the aorta, its most superior point, when it curves, it produces three major branches. These major branches include the brachiocephalic trunk, and whenever we hear the word trunk, that usually indicates to us that it will further subdivide. Not in all cases, but in most cases it will tell us that it will divide further. So we have the brachiocephalic trunk. The brachiocephalic trunk delivers blood to the right subclavian artery, which is to the right upper limb, and to the right common carotid artery, which supplies the right side of the head and neck. The second division is the left common carotid artery, and this delivers blood to the left internal and external iliac arteries. So these carotid. These common carotid arteries divide further into internal and external carotid arteries. This supplies, the left common carotid artery supplies the left side of the head and neck. The left subclavian artery is the third branch, and it delivers blood to the left vertebral artery. And it supplies to the left vertebral artery, supplying blood to the brain, and then and vessels supplying the left upper limb and thorax. So let's look at these these branches. You will be needed or required to identify these during your practical class. Looking at the heart, again, let's put this into some sort of perspective. What we have here is the heart that's been greyed out so we can see the orientation and the passage of the aorta. So from what we can see here, this is our left atrium, left ventricle, right atrium, right ventricle, and then our left ventricle. What we can see also is as the aorta leaves the heart, we've got the right coronary artery and left coronary artery. This is the ascending aorta, but then it arches to give these three main branches. First branch that we see, as we saw before, is the brachiocephalic artery. So notice on the previous slide we called that a trunk, but artery or trunk is an appropriate terminology here. That will further subdivide to the right subclavian artery that will go to the upper limb, and the right common carotid artery, which will go up to supply the head, neck and brain. Then second branch, get the arrow back, the second branch here is the left common carotid artery, and that's supplying the left side of the head and neck. And then we also have the third branch, the left subclavian artery, supplying the left upper limb. You'll notice then that the aorta then curves and starts to descend, and we call this the descending aorta, or we can also call that in this region the thoracic aorta, as described here. We use these subdivisions and terminologies for the aorta because the aorta is quite an extensive long structure. Long structure. And because of that, when we're in different body regions like the thorax or the abdomen, we will give it distinctive names. Thoracic aorta, abdominal aorta, and that just helps to define the region that we are examining. So this leads us to the abdominal aorta. Once the thoracic aorta passes through the thoracic diaphragm, it becomes the abdominal aorta. And this extends inferiorly from the aortic hiatus in the thoracic diaphragm. So that's an opening within the diaphragm to accommodate the aorta, and extends down to the level of L4. So that's lumbar vertebrae 4. At this point, the aorta at approximately L4 will divide into the common iliac arteries. So we have a left and a right common iliac arteries, and these are responsible for supplying the pelvic region and the lower limb. Extending off the abdominal aorta are three major branches. Three major anterior branches. So when we say anterior branches, as the name suggests, they are branching from the anterior surface of the aorta. We then also have lateral branches, and these lateral branches extend from the lateral sides of the aorta. So the names really will tell you or the type of branch they are. But within the anterior branches, we have the celiac artery or trunk. Again, we see that word trunk because this artery subsequently divides into another three arteries. We have the superior mesenteric artery and the inferior mesenteric artery. And the superior and inferior mesenteric artery are important for supplying the small intestine, being the superior mesenteric, and then large intestine, or the inferior mesenteric artery. The lateral branches include the renal arteries, which supply the kidneys, and then the gonadal arteries. And the gonadals are a generic term. If we are talking about males, these would be called testicular arteries, and if they're females, we would call about them as the ovarian arteries. But gonadal is a generic term given to these structures. So they're supplying the sex organs. Looking at these major branches now, an illustration, we're just going to go through the names of them and help you to identify them. You will be expected to identify these during your class. In the thoracic diaphragm, here's the thoracic diaphragm with the aortic hiatus. So we can see the aorta passing through this muscular feature, which is the thoracic diaphragm. Immediately after it passes down into the abdomen and becomes the abdominal aorta, the very first branch it provides is the celiac trunk. This celiac trunk, as you can see, is an anterior branch, and as this image is extended here, so you can see the further subdividing into the three that we'll talk about shortly. The second anterior branch is the superior mesenteric artery, and that's this branch here. So there's the celiac trunk, this is our superior mesenteric artery, and that supplies all the small intestine and imparts the proximal parts of the large intestine. The third anterior branch is the inferior mesenteric artery. That's what we can see here. And that is usually located about the level L3. So vertebral level L3 is where we would find this arising from the anterior surface of the aorta. Also on this is our branches we spoke about before. Here's our aorta, continuing down to about L4, where it'll divide into the common iliac arteries, to a left and a right common iliac arteries. The two lateral branches we noted on the last slide are the renal arteries. So you can see those, the left and right renal arteries, and they almost come off relatively at the same level, opposite each other. However, the gonadal arteries, we have the left and the right gonadal artery, and you will notice that they arise from the lateral sides of the aorta, but they're actually offset from each other. They don't arise at exactly the same vertebral level. This slide now just takes into account and shows us the organs that these branches supply. So previously, in the previous slide, we just saw the trunks or the origins of these arteries. Now this actually shows you the full extent of what they supply and which organs they supply. We have touched on this already, but this is a nice little summary of what we've already discussed. The celiac artery or trunk divides in a further three branches, as we said before, but this helps to supply the liver, the stomach, and the spleen. So this is all supplied by the celiac trunk. The superior mesenteric artery, this branch here, the second branch, will supply most of the small intestine. I won't say most of it, it's all of it except the duodenum, because the duodenum is part of the small intestine, but it does not supply the duodenum. It supplies all the small intestine, and as you can see, it supplies part of the ascending and part of the transverse colon. The inferior mesenteric artery is the third branch, and it helps to supply the remainder, this dark section here, this supplies the remainder of the transverse colon, the descending colon, into the sigmoid colon as well. The celiac trunk, as I said, trunk meaning it gives rise to further branches. So really the celiac trunk or the celiac artery is only about 1 centimetre long, and then it gives rise to three main branches. These branches are the splenic artery, the common hepatic artery, and the left gastric artery. So those are the three branches associated, or three subsequent branches from the celiac trunk. The splenic artery supplies the spleen and the pancreas. It gives off a small branch called the left gastro-omental artery, or otherwise known as the gastroepiploic artery. And that's a small branch that passes down around the greater curvature of the stomach to supply the stomach and part of the omentum. The common hepatic artery being the second branch. The common hepatic artery will further divide into the hepatic artery proper. And this is the artery that supplies the liver. The other subdivision, so the common hepatic artery will divide into the hepatic artery proper and the gastroduodenal artery. And the gastroduodenal artery is important because it helps to supply the duodenum, the pancreas, and then it gives off a branch that also supplies the stomach. So even though we call it the common hepatic artery, common meaning it's a common origin, but it supplies numerous organs from there because of these subdivisions into further arteries. And finally, we have the left gastric artery. This supplies the stomach and the inferior esophagus. And the left gastric artery, when it supplies the stomach, supplies the lesser curvature of the stomach. So here is our model that you will see in the classroom, and you will be expected to be able to identify these three main anterior branches. Here is our thoracic diaphragm, and the most superior anterior branch is the celiac trunk. This is our abdominal aorta all the way through here, down to the common iliac arteries, but most superior, as we said, celiac trunk. Then the next anterior branch is the superior mesenteric artery, and then the lower anterior branch is the inferior mesenteric artery. Please be familiar with these structures when you're in the prac room. Now we're going to talk about the lateral branches of the abdominal aorta. These include the renal arteries, the paired arteries that supply the kidneys, and the gonadal arteries. So these again are paired arteries, as we saw before, that arise inferior to the renal arteries, and they're testicular arteries in the male, or ovarian arteries if we're in the female, and they supply the gonads, so that being the testes or the ovaries, the sex the sex organs in the body. This is the same model we saw just a moment ago, but now the labels are donating those lateral branches. And these lateral branches include the common iliacs, as we saw before, and the gonadal artery. So there's the right gonadal artery, and here is the left gonadal artery. So here is the left gonadal artery. What we can't see and what's not labelled here, well, we can see it but not very well, is the right and the left renal arteries. And they're those lateral branches moving towards the kidneys. So do note they can be seen, it's just the labels have not included it. So that's the left renal artery, right renal artery, because our veins, or the renal veins, are obstructing that from this view, and that's just the relationship of the veins to the arteries. So now we're going to talk about the second type of vessel in the body, and these are the capillaries. They are the smallest blood vessels, and they have a very thin walls. They're only about 7 micron thin, and they're composed of tunica intima only. They do not contain any other other tunics. Remember, the arteries and veins have all 3 tunics, but capillaries are only composed of the tunica intima. So this is the site where materials can diffuse between the blood and the cells of the body. So this is where gas and nutrient exchange is occurring, and where waste will enter back into the bloodstream to be removed from the body. Each cell is very close, so they're less than 100 microns from a capillary. So every cell of the body is within 100 microns of a capillary. The only exception to this is ligaments, cartilage and tendons. These are not very vascular. They're considered almost avascular because they have a very low blood supply. And within the cells of the body, there's extensive branching, which means it's slow blood flow because of the extensive branching into the capillary beds. There's slow it slows the blood down and allows for adequate time for the gas and nutrient diffusion to occur between the body cells and the blood. So it's very important in that respect. Here we can see the capillaries. We're looking at the capillary structure. This pink structure here, not the capillaries are pink in real life, but for the purpose of this illustration, it is pink. It's showing you it's just a layer of endothelium with individual cells. And that's really what makes up this area. One structure alone is a capillary, but normally these will exist in a vast network that we call within an organ or cells, and these are called the capillary bed, and that's what this pink area depicts here. So the arteries we saw before get smaller and smaller until eventually we call them arterioles, and they are the smallest of the arteries or structures that we would denote as arteries. The arterioles will eventually enter into the capillary bed, and you'll notice that these capillary beds that there are small sphincters, and these sphincters help to regulate the flow of blood into these areas. So from the arteriole, we let out these little branches that become metarterioles, and these metarterioles will move into these capillary structures. And as I said, capillaries usually function in a group, so as we know it as a capillary bed. Gaseous exchange will happen in this capillary bed, so oxygen's removed and carbon dioxide's returned to the blood as a waste product, and then that moves out through into the venous system, which is why we've gone from a red oxygenated blood to the gaseous exchange component back now to deoxygenated blood, where we enter into the venule, which is a small version of a vein. Veins are the largest structures and venules are the smallest of the veins in the body. These sphincters, they are rings of smooth muscle, and they're found at the bases of the capillary bed. Notice they're only on the capillary side. From the arteries, we do not find them on the venule side. It is in the capillaries here that the exchange of materials between the blood and the tissue occurs. Oxygen can occur because of the very thin vessel. So we can see that oxygen, carbon dioxide, and most nutrients and metabolic waste pass through, or pass between the blood and tissue fluids by diffusion. So they pass out through here, as we can see. Sorry, I'm losing my pointer. In general, smaller water-soluble material such as amino acids and sugars can pass through the small gaps in the capillary lining, like this, as we can see. Lipid molecules and gases can pass directly through the endothelial membranes. So they can pass through the membranes in this case. And the way these are removed, so this gaseous exchange process, or the way the materials are exchanged, is through hydrostatic pressure, osmotic pressure, and diffusion. These are the principles that are occurring to allow this diffusion to take place, or this exchange to take place within the capillaries. After blood has passed through the capillary bed, it then heads to the venous system, and veins return deoxygenated blood to the heart. As the blood gets closer to the heart, the vessels gradually thicken and increase in diameter. Veins have relatively thin, floppy walls compared to arteries, and mostly because of the lack of, or veins lack that thick tunica media associated with arteries. But these floppy walls are thin compared to the arteries, and the blood in these vessels is at a very low pressure compared to the arteries. With their large diameters and thin walls, the veins can swell to accommodate large proportion of the body's blood supply, and in some cases, up to 60% of the blood of the body total blood volume can be found in the veins at any one time. The veins can be thought of as blood reservoirs, and they are often referred to as capacitance vessels. Blood supply to the heart can be increased by increases of the return of the blood from these veins. So, as you can see. When we look at the structure of the vein, earlier we looked at the structure of the artery, now we're looking at the structure of the vein. In the veins, the pressure is relatively low, and because of that, when we look at the tunica media, it's relatively thin compared to the tunica adventitia. The adventitia is the thickest part of a vein, where the tunica media is the thickest part of an artery. We still have the tunica intima, as we saw before, but what we also note too is this valve. Within the veins are these structures called venous valves. Also note with this particular slide that there is a lot more collagen than elastic fibres. So because the present in the tunic layers, so the elastic fibres are still about the same as what we saw before, but the collagen layer is getting thicker. The valves also have this, as we said, this valve, and this is probably is important at this point to point out, this is a one-way valve. Much like the valves that are in the heart, the valves in the veins act as one-way valves to keep pushing the blood in a certain direction. Because the blood pressure in the veins is so low, the valves help to keep the blood moving in the right direction, and that is towards the heart. So they close behind it and keep pushing it in that direction. So to keep the blood moving in that direction, towards the heart or through the venous system, the valves need a little bit help to work. And there's a number of mechanisms that can help the veins to keep pumping the blood in the direction of the heart. And one of these mechanisms is the muscular pump. So the pressure of the blood in the veins, the venous pressure, as we said before, is not adequate enough to push it through the venous system itself. So it has these valves. But the valves alone are not enough to keep pushing the blood forward. What it does need is structures around it, and that's where the skeletal muscles surrounding the veins come into play. So the skeletal muscles surrounding the veins will, when they contract during movement, so if they contract for any type of movement during normal body movement, they actually put pressure onto the veins and help to push the blood that's in that vessel away through the valve and keep moving it forward towards the heart. So it's pushed by these muscular contractions that then are applied by these skeletal muscles. And this is a very good illustration here to show that. This is the muscles in their relaxed state with a vein with the valves. So you can see the direction of the valves indicate that the blood flow is in this direction. When the muscles contract, they tend to shorten, so they tend to bulge. And when they bulge and they put this pressure on the vein, what it does is forcibly pushes the blood through the valve into the next section of the vessel. This is important because it helps to keep the blood moving moving towards the heart. If the muscles don't contract, the blood will pool, and this sometimes can lead to a blood loss or people feeling faint. You might see people on parade for a long period of time. They may get faint because the blood will pool. So a little trick is usually just to keep wiggling your muscles and just contracting your muscles in your leg to help keep the blood moving, and that usually will stop these soldiers and that on parade from fainting. Now we're going to talk about some of the major veins, and we're almost at the end of the lecture, and we'll conclude by talking about these major veins and being able to identify them on the model. The largest veins in the abdomen is the inferior vena cava. We have the abdominal aorta in the abdomen, and the accompanying vessel or the accompanying vein with that is the inferior vena cava. So we see those running side by side. The inferior vena cava drains blood from the lower limbs, from the pelvic cavity, and many structures and organs in the abdominal cavity. And the major tributaries will include a number of vessels. Now, when we talk about veins, we talk about tributaries. So think of it like a river, a long river going into the sea, and little creeks coming off the side of that are tributaries that contribute to that. And that's very much the same with the venous system, and particularly the inferior vena cava. So the major tributaries or the major contributions to the inferior vena cava include the common iliac veins, and we talked about the common iliac arteries before. So now it should be no surprise as to where we'll find the location of the common iliac veins. We have renal veins and gonadal veins and hepatic veins, all contributing or acting as tributaries to the inferior vena cava. Notice that all these names we have come across before when we were talking about the arteries. So now these are simply the veins and accompany those arteries, because veins and arteries travel together in the deep regions of the body. The common iliac veins drain, and we have two, one from the left, one from the right, drain blood from the lower limbs and the contents of the pelvic cavity. The renal veins drain blood from the kidneys. The gonadal veins, again, we use that as a generic term, but they can be testicular veins if they're in the male and ovarian veins if they're in the females, and they are responsible for draining the gonads or the sex organs. And then we have the hepatic veins, and these drain the liver. We have three of these coming from each of the lobes of the liver, and they drain directly into the inferior vena cava as it passes up through the liver. So looking at a diagram first, our little schematic here. When we talk about veins, the direction we talk about them in the flowing or the blood flowing from the extremity to the heart. So in that case, because of that, we're going to talk about the veins from the lower part of the screen to the superior part as it's moving to the heart. In contrast, when we talk about arteries, we talk about blood moving away from the heart. So we tend to talk about arteries from in the superior to inferior when we do these discussions. But today I'm going to start my discussion by starting at the lower part of the screen. The left common iliac vein, and then we have the right common iliac vein, will form a union that will become the inferior vena cava. And this will happen at about that L4 vertebral level, which is about the same level that the aorta bifurcates or divides into the two common iliac arteries. So they approximate to each other. Veins and arteries are very similar. Names might be different, but their positions in this case are similar. So the left common iliac vein, that should be right common iliac vein, left common iliac vein become the inferior vena cava. The inferior vena cava receives some lateral branches, and some of these branches include the right gonadal artery, the right renal vein, the left renal vein, and then sitting directly here is the hepatic veins. So one thing we didn't cover was the left gonadal vein. The left gonadal vein arises from the gonads in the pelvis, or the left gonads, and it continues all the way up, and in most cases will drain into the left renal vein. So it drains into the left renal vein. In some cases it might drain into the inferior vena cava, but in most cases it will drain into the left renal vein. And then from there, its contribution to the inferior vena cava is via the renal vein. We then have, as we said before, we then see the hepatic veins, and the liver would sit in this position in the person. So these are draining directly from the lobes of the liver into the inferior vena cava. The inferior vena cava then passes up through the caval opening. So that's an opening in the thoracic diaphragm specifically for the inferior vena cava. If we look over here to the left of the inferior vena cava, that opening there is our aortic hiatus, which is where before we would have seen the thoracic aorta pass through the diaphragm to become the abdominal aorta. So it's just giving you some relevance to that. This is our final slide, and this is looking at that same model that we saw earlier when we were looking at the arteries, but it's now getting you to identify, or it's labeling the veins, the major veins in the abdominal region. We have the inferior vena cava. Let's get the arrow back up. The inferior vena cava, and notice how it sits to the right of the abdominal aorta that we saw before. So there's our abdominal aorta and the inferior vena cava. Notice how the left and the right common iliac veins accompany the right and left common iliac arteries. And where the aorta divides to become the common iliac arteries is also about the same position. The left and right common iliac veins will join to become the inferior vena cava. We can see the gonadal veins. We can see the right gonadal vein, and then we see the left gonadal vein. And the left gonadal vein in the model extends all the way up to the left renal vein. See also the right renal vein, but what we do not see on this model here is the hepatic veins, because the liver has been removed, and on this particular model in the prac room you do not see that. Just get that model back up. So I'm sorry about that, my computer had a hiccup. So what we're seeing is those structures. Note the pairing of the artery and the veins, and remembering all those things we spoke about today in these lectures. So that concludes our lecture. Please listen to the lecture over and over if you need to revise something, and I thank you for your time today.